Welcome to News from Neptune for December 13th in the antepenultimate week of 2019. That's a phrase from grammar, before the next to last. This is the 50th of 52 weeks in the year. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in the aftermath of World War I, and I've just been reading Keynes' Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was written at the same time. A remarkable book, and says more about the 20th century than a lot of books written much later in the 20th century.
Interesting. Haven't heard of it.
Luxemburg said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist actually means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda against socialism. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says, "Terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in Karl Marx's sense in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism." Close quote. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialists made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a My Back Pages edition of News from Neptune. I ended up with that line from Bob Dylan for a number of reasons, but specifically because I want to mention two minor figures that turned up this week in various ways in the political imbroglio, whose name happened to be Page, Lisa Page and Carter Page.
Okay.
The impeachment campaign in the U.S. is about maintaining the neocon, neolib policies of the Obama administration, in the Trump administration, and the Tory victory in the UK elections is about Brexit, freeing Britain from the neolib policies of the European Union. So there are certain similarities here, certain reflections of what is going on in the capitalist democracies as they style themselves in the U.S. and UK. Neoliberalism is ruled by big business, turbo-capitalism, if you like, where wealth concentrates at an accelerating rate and wages stagnate. The UK election is the rejection of a decent social democrat, Jeremy Corbyn, you might compare Bernie Sanders, for a populist clown, Boris Johnson, you might compare Donald Trump. Trump and Bojo are champions of the objections to neoliberal rule, where neoliberalism is, as I say, extreme capitalism, in place in the U.S. and the UK for 40 years now. We've been talking recently on this show about the fact that the American Revolution, as it's called, in the 18th century, was the colonial ruling class's rejection of the British government move towards the abolition of slavery, that the American Revolution was in fact a defense of slavery, as the second act of the American Revolution in the middle of the 19th century was. The American colonial elite in the 18th century made its money from slavery, both North and South, but that was interfering with profits of the British ruling class, who wanted to curb the reason the American ruling class was doing so well, and that was, in fact, slavery. So there was a serious move, not for moral reasons, except among some people, a serious move in Britain against slavery, and the American elite saw that and said, we can't have that. That's our meal ticket, and therefore we better get away from these folks in London who say that they are our colonial masters or the masters of these colonies. There's a certain similarity there, perhaps in this Marx's line about the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce, but there's a certain similarity there to the British extraction of their economy from the EU. The EU are a neoliberal master, the European Union. The European Union are the neoliberal masters of the British economy in some ways, and there is a sense in which the popularity of Brexit amongst the well-to-do in Britain has to do with escaping from the neoliberal control from the EU. The election, which occurred yesterday and resulted in a remarkable victory for the Tories, for the Conservatives, particularly in the aftermath of the last year and so of British politics. That election was about Brexit, was about the extraction of Britain from the European Union, and the party that was most identified with Brexit, that is the Conservatives, won handily. So it seems to me that it's hard to deny that Brexit was at the heart of the Tory, the Conservative election victory. One Labour activist said that if you compare the election in 2017 to yesterday's election, in both cases you had an attractive, honest leader of the party and a radical manifesto, as they say, a platform to run on. The only thing that was different was that in 2017 the Labour's supported Brexit, and yesterday the Labour position was far more ambiguous and was understood as opposed to Brexit, opposed to Britain leaving the European Union, and that cost them the election, or so the major reflections on the election go. So it seems to me that we're dealing with at least comparable issues in both societies that should lead us to some reflection on what the present situation of the defense of neoliberalism is in the United States. You buy any of that?
A little bit of it.
Okay, good.
I think that the Brexit issue kind of cross-currented across the other more substantive debates about the social democratic nature of the UK that made it difficult for Corbyn to get his message out clearly and to appeal to those people who would ordinarily support that program in the midst of all the Brexit maelstrom and confusion, as I understand it. And of course, how much the whole anti-Semitism nonsense affected it, I don't know, but it certainly was. It'll be interesting to see, and what we will see is that there will be the problem of anti-Semitism in Britain is now solved. There will be no more of it. We won't hear anything about it. It was all just Jeremy Corbyn, and now he's gone, and we don't have to worry about that anymore. The British Marxist economist Michael Roberts writes a blog, a fairly often technical blog, called the next recession, in which implies that he can use sort of Marxist metrics to predict when the next recession is going to be, although not precisely. It's quite a good blog, I think. Perhaps not for everyone. He writes this morning, this was clearly a Brexit election. The Labour Party had the most radical left-wing program since 1945. The Social and Economic Manifesto of the left Labor leadership was actually quite popular. Labor's campaign was excellent, and the activist turnout to canvass and get the vote in was terrific. But in the end, it made little difference. Brexit still dominated, and the Labour vote was squeezed. Not every voter wanted to, quote-unquote, get Brexit done, but clearly sufficient of the 2016, sufficient numbers, I think, of the 2016 Leave voters had had enough of delay and procrastination by former Prime Minister May and Parliament and wanted the issue dealt with. Usually, Michael Roberts goes on, usually elections are won on what the state of the economy is. This election was generally different, but even so, the measure of economic well-being index, based on the mix of change in real disposable income and unemployment rate, suggested an improvement since former PM May lost her majority in 2017. The economy at the level of investment and output may have been stagnating, but the average UK household was feeling slightly better off since 2017, with full employment and slight improvement in real incomes. That helped the Johnson government. And there's just one more paragraph of this longer article.
This is important.
Yeah, what now? Michael Roberts asks. The government under Johnson will now move quickly to pass through Parliament the legislation necessary for the UK to leave the EU by the end of January at the latest. And then the more tortuous process of signing up a trade deal with the EU will begin. And parenthetically, I would say, of signing up a trade deal with the U.S.
Exactly.
Which was of some import during the last days before of this campaign. That Roberts goes on, that is supposed to be completed by June 2020 unless the UK asks for an extension. Johnson will try to avoid that, and he can now make all the kinds of concessions to the EU in order to get a deal done without the fear of a backlash from no-deal Brexiters in his party, as he has a big enough majority to see them off.
I think that's exactly right. And that's an example of the fulfillment of the prediction that we had from Noam Chomsky, as a matter of fact, when this argument began. The argument about Brexit, the argument about Britain leaving the European Union. Chomsky pointed out that, yes, that given the development, economic and political, of Europe, Britain, and the U.S. since the Second World War, what we're looking at here is the departure of Britain from the Europe that the U.S. wanted to make essentially an economic colony and has done so to some extent, and the embrace of Britain by the U.S. Britain has moved across the Atlantic, economically speaking, and that will be the part of the discussion that will go on by the Johnson government and what we've got to say is the Trump government. So given the notion that the Trump government in fact doesn't exercise so much independence within the U.S. as the Johnson government does in Britain, it could be a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, the deal, the U.S.-UK trade deal, or incipient trade deal, which I referred to, was in the news the last few days because of word that as part of this trade deal, the U.S. political establishment, economic, financial, Wall Street establishment, especially medical, pharmaceutical, industrial complex, will basically insist as a part of a trade deal that the UK privatize its nationalized healthcare system. It's important to note that the UK runs what is a radical healthcare system, the National Health Service, in which not only is, as in this country, we are arguing over the possibility of the government simply funding healthcare, which will remain in the private sector, not with private insurers, but with private doctors and private hospitals and private pharmaceutical companies. The government will not own the health service in the way, even under a Sanders plan, the government will not own health care the way that the British National Health Service still, in spite of the privatization that's been going on since Thatcher, owns basically the kind of infrastructure of their healthcare system. So hopefully some of these differences will come out during this upcoming Medicare for all debate in this country, along with whatever is going on during this U.S.-UK trade deal, which may involve Britain's a privatization of Britain's healthcare system.
This is an extremely important point for both the U.S. and the U.K. We have to remember that at the end of the Second World War, for all the fact that our U.S. mythology makes a hero out of Winston Churchill and suggests that he single-handedly won the war against Nazism.
He was so great that he got booted right out.
And that's the important point.
Yeah.
That the British people at the end of the Second World War threw Churchill and the politics of the Second World War by the British ruling class into the trash. Into the rubbish, if you like. And that was exactly what they meant to do. And the greatest victory, electoral or otherwise, of British socialism occurred in 1945. It occurred after the end of the war with the booting out of Churchill and the establishment of a socialist government, a Labour government at least, in Britain. And the first thing that Labour government did was to establish the National Health Service to do a more thorough job than even is being proposed all these years later in the U.S. when we talk about Medicare for all. They socialized it, and they socialized it by taking over what was a private healthcare system and running it for the benefit of the community. Everyone on every side has recognized what a sea change this was, and British and American capitalists made sure that such a terrible thing would not happen again. It's been pointed out that this was possible in Britain because Britain didn't have a constitution, that protected the private property of the healthcare system and allowed a democratic assembly, the British Parliament, to nationalize the health service at the end of the Second World War. Well, now they're trying to reverse that now, essentially, by selling off the British health service to the certainly privatized, health service or health system in the U.S. That's a big issue for this country and for that country, and it's a question of how retrograde Britain is going to be in these matters as the U.S. struggles to make a little progress in that direction, nowhere near the progress that was made all those years ago in Britain at the end of the Second World War. So these issues are very serious. They're very serious for everybody, and they're very much on the table in the relationship between the U.S. And the U.K. Stay tuned.
Yeah, for some reason it occurred to me when I was doing a little bit of research this morning about these things and thinking about, and I've read some articles recently about the strike wave in this country, the labor strike wave in this country during World War II, and the ornery nature of labor unions in a good way after World War II. And I guess it occurred to me for some reason that while people are at war, they're in a fighting mood, and when they come back from war, they're kind of still in a fighting mood in a strange way. They're fighting for peace. I mean, they're fighting for a kind of normal life, and they do things. Once out of their uniforms, they get into a state with their own government that, as it would happen in this country after World War I, also, which is why both after World War I and World War II in this country, you needed an enormous amount of political repression.
Exactly.
To keep anything from happening as a result of how people's expectations when they both fight a war and win a war, quote unquote, win a war. And after World War II in this country, the American capitalist system had to go into full bore in terms of both the programs and propaganda, everything from Taft-Hartley, the Anti-Union Act of 1946, that basically mitigated the gains that had been made in the 1930s with the Wagner Act and so forth, and it had to go into full bore in terms of what this woman many years ago, Elizabeth Phones Wolfe, wrote in a book called "Selling Free Enterprise," that just had to reconvince the returning soldiers and everyone else that we were still a capitalist country and we can't be messing with all this socialist stuff. And of course, on that, well, what went along with that was, of course, the ramping up of the Cold War against our former allies in the Soviet Union, in which, of course, they were demonized. Thank you very much, Harry Truman.
We could look at two parallel political activities, direct and serious political activities by the American government after World War I and after World War II to deal with the problem that David has just described. Look at the Palmer raids, named for Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General at the end of World War I, when radicals of various sorts, and radicals in this sense meant any critics of the American economy and the American political system of the Eugene Debs sort and others like that. People were simply rounded up and in many cases shipped off to the Soviet Union. But the raids were direct political repression of political opinions that threatened the American ruling class. The parallel after the Second World War was, of course, McCarthyism, the whole attempt to demonize as foreign agents, foreign activists for the Soviet Union, any of the critics of the American political and economic system as it existed after 1945. So McCarthyism and the Palmer raids were simply the acting out of the position of the American government vis-a-vis criticism. Now, there are suggestions that these are important background. This is a bit of important background for the present situation of the American ruling class about the danger of criticism coming from unlikely places, such as the campaign of Bernie Sanders. Some things don't change, and in this case, what the U.S. political establishment is willing to countenance as legitimate criticism is one of those things.
So,
you're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media in the context of the history that we don't talk about much in this country.
So to make a slight segue, but still deal with the issue of health care or the relationship between our economic circumstances in health care, I thought I would try to juxtapose these two articles from the last week. One is an often mentioned Thomas Edsall column in the New York Times, which usually continues his usual analysis of how the American people have become more divided from each other by Donald Trump. Trump has a gift for tearing us apart. There are a lot of different ways to build walls. And he quotes a political scientist, as he always does, Mark Hetherington, a political scientist at the University of North Carolina, my former school, and the co-author, also Michael Jordan's former school, and the co-author of an academic article called Prius or Pickup: How the Answers to Four Simple Questions Explain America's Great Divide. Hetherington believes Democrats may be walking into a trap. In an email to Thomas Edsall, Hetherington wrote, "Liberal Democrats don't seem to realize they are out of step with the rest of the American public when it comes to immigration and racial attitudes." Hetherington writes, "There is a, quote, human tendency for people to think that most others see the world more like they do rather than how their opponents see it. Most consequentially," Edsall writes, Liberals seem to think that surely most Americans are fine with the more porous borders. It would be cold and heartless for people to believe otherwise, not to mention economically short-sighted. Hetherington argued that the research he and his UNC colleague Jonathan Weiler did in writing Prius or Pickup shows that liberal faith in widespread support of immigration is, quote, is not even remotely true. Now, the point I want to make here, I'm not going to dive back into the niceties of how immigrants may help some people, including themselves, and be perceived to hurt other people, mainly people in the heartland area, in the quote unquote heartland areas of this country. But let's just broaden our view, because human beings actually are more than a collection of attitudes about these issues that is studyable by political science. People actually live lives and often die under economic circumstances that may ultimately persuade or shape their attitudes much more. And so I saw a link today. It was either on Jeffrey St. Clair's column on Counterpunch or Rob Urry's column on Counterpunch, but it doesn't matter. It's an article in JAMA, one of a series of articles that talks about increased mortality rates in this country among middle-aged people. The authors are Stephen Wolfe and Heidi Shoemaker, both spelled in funny ways. And the title is Life Expectancy and Mortality Rates in the United States, 1959 to 2017. And the findings of this article in one paragraph are as follows. Between 1915 and 2016, U.S. life expectancy increased from 69.9 years to 78.9 years, but declined for 3 consecutive years after 2014. The recent decrease in U.S. life expectancy culminated a period of increasing cause-specific mortality among adults aged 25 to 64 years that began in the 1990s, ultimately an increase in all-cause mortality that began in 2010. During 2010 through 2017, midlife all-cause mortality rates increased from 328 deaths per 100,000 to 348 deaths per 100,000, increase of 20 per 100,000, which is a lot in public health epidemiological terms. By 2014, that was my view there. Back to the text. By 2014, midlife mortality was increasing across all racial groups caused by drug overdoses, alcohol abuse, suicides, and a diverse list of organ system diseases. And here's the really interesting part that they get at that isn't quite getting at by some of the other articles in this genre. The largest relative increases in midlife mortality rates occurred in New England, New Hampshire, 23%, Maine, 20%, Vermont, 20%, and the Ohio Valley, West Virginia, 23%, Ohio, 22%, rounding up, Indiana, 15%, Kentucky, 15%. The increase in midlife mortality during 2010-2017 was associated with an estimated 33,000 excess U.S. deaths, 32% of which occurred in 4 Ohio Valley states. These are the states, by and large, that are up for grabs in the Trump, were up for grabs in 2016 and will be up for grabs in 2020. This is a context that we can understand. You may not be able to do survey research about what people's attitudes are about opioid abuse, about suicide, about alcoholism, and so forth. But these actual material circumstances may actually affect the votes of these people and the attitudes of these people as much as whether they drive a Prius or a pickup, or as whether they view immigration as a good thing or a bad thing. So this very narrow liberal political science view of Edsel and his interlocutors should be challenged just by understanding what the material circumstances are of people who may not necessarily think of themselves as anti-immigrant or racist, whether or not they think we need more people from other countries to come to this country. I don't see that's really relevant to how they view their world. It's just something that Trump has managed to exploit at a kind of superficial level, and the liberals like Edsel and the New York Times want to run with it.
I'm worried about the segue. Once again, how do we make these these changes? I want to talk about two people named Page, as I said,
Okay.
that have nothing to do with each other.
Just a sharp segue there.
Nor anything to do with what you were just saying. So that's the problem, right?
Okay.
What I have in mind here is
Yeah.
Lisa Page, the FBI lawyer, who was whose conversation with the head of counterintelligence for the FBI included an important conversation. Both of these folks were on Mueller's staff. An important conversation about how the FBI would stop Trump from becoming president. It was scandalous enough when the Inspector General revealed this particular conversation and the connection between Page and Peter Strzok, the head of the counterintelligence arm of the FBI, was enough to produce some rather bawdy comments by Trump at a rally. But the important question here is the extent to which it was clear that the FBI and the Mueller investigation were made up of people who thought that they had the right to stop Trump from becoming president, and, perhaps more importantly, thought that they could do it. And that's very interesting. After a long silence, Page has begun to give interviews to sympathetic journalists, and the important point, the attitude and the activities of the FBI in regard to the 2016 presidential election and the so-called Russiagate nonsense is illustrated in a way that should give us pause. This is the deep state, if you like, that thinks that it has the right and ability, which is maybe even more important, to control who and what the President of the United States is. This is an interesting phenomenon. The second page is connected to this same phenomenon. I'm speaking here of Carter Page. Carter Page is an American petroleum industry consultant and a former foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump during the presidential election campaign. The FBI went to the FISA court, that is the Foreign Intelligence, the court that is to approve warrants for surveys, spying that is, on foreign agents in the United States, so it said, to get a warrant to investigate Carter Page, of course was an American, on the grounds that he was a possible connection of the Trump campaign to the Kremlin. The interesting point about this is that Carter Page was not such a thing, but the FBI decided that in speaking to the court, it would say he was. They were flat out lying, and it came clear from the Inspector General's report that that was the case. So in both cases, we're talking on both of these pages, we have accounts of way in which the FBI felt that it was willing and able to lie and cheat in order to make the case, the Russiagate case, which in fact they had no evidence of at all. That should disturb us. And it does disturb me.
Yeah, I actually wouldn't have even known much about these Page people if I hadn't watched the Jimmy Dore segment this morning that he did, which was his usual pointed, humorous, and incisive understanding of what is actually going on here. Just to quote from Jeffrey St. Clair this morning on this one. Jeffrey says, I was thrilled to see the FBI being raked over the coals by the GOP and the department's inspector general for their deception and trickery in the FISA warrants to spy on Carter Page. I hope, almost certainly in vain, that this is more than a knee-jerk defense of Trump and is evidence of a real commitment to scale back the most omnipotent powers of our police state, powers previously sanctioned by both parties, which are being used to throw people in prison every day in courthouses across America. Of course, almost all of these people supported the reauthorization of the Patriot Act.
This is Jeffrey being optimistic.
Yeah, it almost doesn't sound like Jeffrey. Yeah.
I don't know. He may be suffering from the storms on the West Coast or something and looking for some ray of sunlight someplace.
Okay.
Might possibly be the case.
Yeah.
Our researcher, Jeffrey Nicholson, sends us a comment on the Jimmy Dore piece that you were speaking of, which indeed is one of the more insightful political sources of political commentary available to us these days, and available on YouTube. I've been watching YouTube recently for the things that they put up, like Jimmy Dore. We'd run pieces of Jimmy Dore's activities here, except that he insists upon speaking Anglo-Saxon on occasion, and of course Anglo-Saxon is banned on American television, and this is a straight racist response to the fact that Anglo-Saxon is rejected by American society and the guardians of public morality on television and whatnot.
It's about time for the Anglo-Saxons to rise up and
and say,
exactly, and say, unfortunately.
But Jimmy, it's hard to run Jimmy's pieces without excising the Anglo-Saxon. But he does report the situation of what the FBI is actually doing. In the most serious case, a low-level FBI lawyer altered an email to make it appear as if Carter Page, the Trump functionary, was not a CIA source when in fact he was, something he confirmed to NBC News in an email. That key fact might have cast his contacts with Russians in a different light, the Inspector General said. The Inspector General's report said the FBI relied heavily on a dossier compiled as part of a Democratic Party-funded opposition research campaign by a former British spy, Christopher Steele. Steele becomes a more and more complex figure in this whole business, involving perhaps even the Skripal affair. The FBI did not inform the FISA court, which had been established to control the out-of-control activities of the FBI in the 1970s, which were finally came to public notice through the Church Committee. An FBI source validation review found that Steele, the British spy, who'd worked with the Bureau in the past, provided information that was only, quote, minimally corroborated. But the FBI didn't tell that to the FISA court, the report says. That is, the FBI used Steele, this ambiguous figure, this ambiguous British spook, to set up what they wanted to do anyhow, and use the FISA court, basically lied to the FISA court in order to get the authorization they needed to do it. The same source said Steele overstated the level of certainty around the notorious story about Trump's supposed sexual dalliance at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Moscow. The source called it unconfirmed rumor and speculation. The report said responsibility for the failures extends high up the FBI's management chain. Quote, that so many basic and fundamental errors were made by 3 separate hand-picked teams on one of the most sensitive FBI investigations, that is Trump and Moscow, that was briefed to the highest levels within the FBI, and the FBI officials expected would eventually be subjected to close scrutiny, raised significant questions regarding the FBI chain of command's management and supervision of the FISA process, close quote. That's bureaucratic speak to say the FBI was lying to the court, and they knew it was, they were lying to the court, and they took this inconsequential figure, Carter Page, as an example of the connections between the Trump campaign and Russia when it was nothing of the sort, and the FBI knew it was nothing of the sort. That's what we're dealing with.
And meanwhile,
back at the ranch,
as Trump is being demonized by the Democrats, of course, and should be for very many reasons, as Jeffrey points out this morning, that while this is going on, the Democrats not only reauthorized the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, and not only in complicated ways among various people, very few people would oppose that on the basis of issues having to do with like Yemen or Gaza or anything like that. And also they cut a deal with him on NAFTA. And so the Democrats, who were the first to implement NAFTA under Bill Clinton, are continuing that despite the fact that Trump ran against NAFTA, so to speak, Trump, who does represent the interests of the capitalist class, and the Democrats, who of course represent the interests of the capitalist class, according to Jeffrey's little statement here, making a deal with Trump on trade the same day that you file articles of impeachment accusing him of being a lying, cheating bastard, that's neoliberalism for you. And then he goes on, why would you hand Trump such sweeping trade authority and allow him to brag about his NAFTA redux as a victory for the working class? Of course, these are the same Democrats who conspired with Newt Gingrich to ram NAFTA down labor's throats. So we know the answer. Wall Street gets what Wall Street wants. The rest is theater. And by theater, he, of course, is referring to the entire impeachment process.
The Steele dossier that I was talking about a moment ago played a central and essential role in the FBI's decision to apply for the surveillance warrants against Trump campaign aide Carter Page, as I said a moment ago, according to the Justice Department Inspector General, whose findings undercut a key claim made by Democrats who defended the Bureau's investigation of the Trump campaign. Not only did Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General, find that the FBI relied heavily on the Steele dossier, the watchdog also discovered significant questions about the reliability of Steele's information. I go on about this in part because I'm convinced there's more to the Steele connection, a good deal more, than we know about already, as I referred to a moment ago in relation to the Skripal affair in Britain. In his dossier, Steele alleged that Page was part of a well-developed conspiracy of cooperation involving, that's a quote, involving the Trump campaign and Russian government. A complete lie, says the Inspector General. Steele, who was working for Democrats, alleged it was Page's idea to release hacked DNC emails through WikiLeaks. Now, this is so far into the realm of fantasy that they don't even mention what is the most likely effect of the most likely source of the famous DNC emails, that is the murdered Seth Rich. The former spy also asserted that Page met secretly with two Kremlin insiders in Moscow in July 2016 to discuss ways to help the Trump campaign while relaxing U.S. sanctions against Russia. The special counsel's report all but debunked those allegations. Robert Mueller, the special counsel, said there was no evidence that Trump associates conspired with Russia or that they worked as Russian agents. So the FBI was not above making up, as apparently it did, stories about poor Carter Page and suggesting that the Trump-Kremlin connection went through him when there was nothing to it at all. This is what we're dealing with. This is the level of fantasy not accidental fantasy, malign fantasy that we're dealing with from the FBI. And Peter Strzok's assertion that they'll keep Trump from becoming president seems to have been backed up by very real activities, lying and cheating by the FBI. We should be concerned about this.
And another thing we should be concerned about is anti-Semitism. Oh, wait, not really. But I am concerned, and it just seems to me that this issue of Israel and Zionism and anti-Semitism have been sort of cross-currenting every debate, everything that's going on, not just to the British election, but, you know, this week we had Donald Trump giving executive order for colleges to behave in a certain way and to declare Jews as having sort of national rights to be treated under something called Title VI in a certain way, which is, you know, that they need to be snowflakes like everyone else on college campuses, and not hear anything derogatory about anything that might be identified with being Jewish, mainly Israel, Zionism, and so forth. At the same time, we have Trump going before this Sheldon Adelson group, this Israel American Council or some such thing, and making grossly ridiculous and arguably or definitely anti-Semitic comments regarding Jews and money and rich people and how he's there to help them and they have to vote for him because why would they vote for someone who's going to take their money away from them, and all of this nonsense. And we have all the various kinds of outrage that goes on with all of this. In the midst of this, we have a nice article that Stephen Saleta wrote on his blog, and that was published, I think, on both on Counterpunch and on Mondoweiss, regarding just exactly how far Palestinians or pro-Palestinians, or people of Palestinian background, should go in sort of treating Zionists and former Zionists, and exactly what the decorum should be. These issues are of concern to me in various ways. But what it occurs to me throughout all this is how the Jewish community, the liberal Jewish community in this country, finds itself between a real rock and a hard place in terms of both opposing Trump and continuing to assert that anti-Semitism is an ongoing thing in this country, in spite of the fact that it's not, and at the same time continuing to oppose Trump, even though Trump supports Israel in ways that they always have, although a little more blatantly.
Yes.
So, and what the result of that seems to me is just sort of confusion and a kind of silence. I mean, there's been some pushback even from liberal Zionist groups, or some people who might define themselves as liberal Zionists, on this executive order that Trump put out, which would really suppress freedom of speech on college campuses. I don't know whether Jim Dye is going to weigh in on this, because he always likes to talk about freedom of speech on college campuses, except when Israel's involved. So, although I guess he did mention it recently when there was a little brouhaha on this campus and things got a little out of control and Chancellor Jones got involved. So, the Jewish community is just in a the liberal Jewish community is in a god-awful mess, because they don't know where to go, they don't know what to do, they don't know what to say. And so basically they're silencing themselves. And they're talking about something else. Let's talk about immigrants. Let's talk about racism. And while we're talking about that, let's throw in something about anti-Semitism, blah, 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 even though that's not really part of the mix. It's just a source of endless fascination and kind of appalling concern to me that people can never get to the point where they realize that getting hooked up with Israel and Zionism has been bad for the liberal Jews. Like the Jews like to say, in the old days, the political expression or the political cliche was, is it good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? And now it's after all this, ironically, it turns out that having a Jewish state, having a right-wing Jewish state, is bad for the Jews.
Exactly.
Who knew?
And it seems to me that you're right to point out the assimilation, so to speak, forgive the word, of this tradition to the identitarian politics that turns support for the criminality of the State of Israel into an issue of identity politics for the Jews.
Yeah.
And that again is what looks like what looks like being good for the Jews.
Yeah.
That is the identitarian assimilation of Jews to those now considered to be left politics, identitarian politics, is in fact a defense of the crimes of the State of Israel, and that's not good for anybody.
Yeah, and I don't mean to imply that all of these liberal people, if they just had the scales drop from their eyes regarding Israel, that they would see the error of their ways in other ways and become anti-neoliberal and anti-neoconservative and harshly critical of U.S. foreign policy. That's not where they're going. It's just that the whole Israel, for people who like to think of themselves as having liberal values and supporting civil rights and human rights and sort of other minority causes, for these people, the Israel issue exposes their basic support for the neoliberal, neoconservative agenda. It puts the rubber to the road, and some of them say, a few of them say, when you really look at all this, none of this is any good. But what most people want to do is just sort of get on with their sort of sanctimonious liberal lives and not worry too much about the fact that they might be racist too. They not worry about the fact that the sort of irony that one of the people who came up with the theory or the idea of the great replacement was a European Jew who was talking about Arabs, and that notion of replacement has come to be a part of right-wing discourse, and it primarily is a part of right-wing discourse, but there's a Zionist aspect to that. It's kind of trivial, but it's kind of ironic, kind of interesting in a certain way.
We've argued for a long time that, or I have at least, don't know entirely how much David agrees with me on this, but I've contended for a while that Trump is being impeached because he's the first major party candidate in 40 years to attack the neocon and neo-lib policies of all recent administrations, neocon being more war, neo-lib policies being more austerity. That's Trump's original sin, and like most original sins, he perhaps is not aware of committing it. But in the eyes of his critics, that's exactly what he did. Although in office, he's largely adopted those neocon and neo-lib policies, and the distinction between the war-making and war provocations of this administration and the last one are a little hard to see, except in his rhetoric, except in what Trump says. The permanent government can condemn what he says, deep state, call it what you like, can condemn what he says for fear that he might actually act on it by, for example, withdrawing from Afghanistan or even Syria. And the need to suppress Trump and indeed remove him from office grows from the political establishment's fear that Trump might actually act on some of his bombast. These attacks of his on the policies of the previous administration made him president. And that's what the political establishment realizes and has to find some way to suppress. Trump spoke for the growing populist wave in this country, who saw that the promises of prosperity coming from the previous administration, hope and change from Obama and so forth, weren't coming about. And the rejection of the narrative, if you like, of the previous administration made Trump president. Trump flipped 6 states, as David mentioned earlier, that had gone for Obama in 2012: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, and Florida, in his victory over Clinton. All those states were lost by Obama voters who stayed home rather than voting again for a Democratic nominee. They voted for Obama, but they wouldn't vote for Clinton. And they voted for, they did that because they had seen no hope and change, which they were promised, in their own personal circumstances. Well, the papers were full of the glories of the Obama administration. People on the ground, so to speak, knew what was happening and how they had been put to the ground. All Trump's opponents seem to have against him in that regard are schoolboy insults, the orange man bad approach to Trump, rather than a real discussion of the policies, the actual policies that led people to reject the notion that they had been told the truth by the Obama administration. They decided they hadn't. They decided they'd been lied to, and that Trump was properly condemning those people who had lied to them. That flipped the 6 states, and I can't see many reasons why it won't happen again. I won't vote for Trump.
One reason might be Bernie Sanders, but
well,
optimistically speaking.
Optimistically speaking, exactly. And indeed,
and the polls show all the major Democratic Party candidates ahead of Trump by 6 or 7%, according to one. I think Jeffrey St. Clair might have linked to that this morning.
All the polls, though.
Not that I'd like to talk about polls. I know.
No. I think indeed we should talk about them, and the extent to which a number of them, 538, for example, don't have much of a record from the last administration. All those polls that told us that Clinton was a runaway victor in the last presidential election should at least suggest we put a question mark behind what they're telling us beside what they're saying today.
Nate Silver is no longer the fair-haired boy. But let me just say one thing before we close. We've got about 2 minutes here.
Sure.
I think one could perhaps distinguish between the very powerful forces in the deep state and the military-industrial complex and the Democratic Party establishment who fall into the category to which you refer. But on a more everyday level in this academic community, all the people who feel themselves liberal and feel like they don't really support the war policies and they really would like to see a little less economic inequality or more economic equality. These are, these members of the professional managerial classes, they say, these are all people who don't really like to see themselves in the neo-lib, neocon context, but they have trouble, just like they have trouble getting out of the Zionist context. And Kerry Nelson just sort of celebrates being in the Zionist context. But that aside, they have a hard time getting out of that neoliberal, neocon context in relation to Trump. So, but they reduce it more to their dislike for, as you have always said, for Trump's peculiar ways of expressing himself. And this latest thing with speaking before the Sheldon Adelson group, I mean, that's on the one hand, that's going to give them more fodder. But on the other hand, they're going to have to, if they go along far enough with that, going to say, well, what about Israel? Why is a president saying these things to a Jewish group? What does that mean about my fellow Jews and whether I'm with them or not?
You've been watching news from Neptune for the 50th week of 2019, a My Back Pages edition. But I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now.
I always liked the Birds version of My Back Pages, although it leaves out one of the best verses. But whatever.
News from Neptune is presented by Carl Osterbrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Leggett and Andrew Scollery. See the research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson. Before he was elected, Obama said he would withdraw from Afghanistan, but he was obviously lying, and in his first term increased U.S. troops there by tens of thousands. Trump said the same in his campaign, but in office was unable to do so, apparently because of the opposition of the Pentagon, the CIA, and the State Department. Tulsi Gabbard is the only anti-war candidate running for president now, with the possible exception of the ambiguous Sanders. Gabbard said on Tuesday that she would put an end to the war in Afghanistan and bring all U.S. troops home within her first year if elected president. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.